Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's day 760. This weed has gone on unchecked for long enough. It's got those seed pods much like dandelions. I still think this is sow thistle. In any case, it doesn't warrant enough effort to do a thorough investigation. I'm not going to sequence the genome of this thing just to know what it is. If any of you know, please write so in the comments. To me, it's not that important. It's very dandelion-like, very weedy, but nothing like a normal dandelion. So I'm shaking all the seeds off, and they float away just like dandelion seeds do. The seed pods, if you can call them that, are not as spherical and bushy. They're more part of a sphere. So I'm pulling this, and I realized that the root system is actually very weak and sparse. It's surprising, yet not surprising, because I thought the taproot went all the way to the watering tray. I must have broken it off, and as you can see here, it's already reproduced. I did a shaking. I tried to get most of the seeds from the first seed pod off the balcony, but that's what happened. And there's already 4, so it's reproduced in this pot and outside this pot. And this all reminds me of how sandy the soil is. I made this potting mix with sand mixture 2 years ago, and you can see a spider that escaped. It's a refugee now. I don't know where the spider went. I didn't follow where it went. It's probably made a home elsewhere on my balcony with one of my other plants. So I'm just cutting this up, shaking all the detritus and filth off the balcony. And there's another 1 or 2 of these tiny little seedlings. So this thing has a very high rate of fecundity. It hasn't been in this pot for that long. I think just, was it 2 episodes or 3 episodes? So this is a very sandy mixture. It's got terrestrial algae or moss or whatever in there. So let's have a look at that taproot in the watering tray. It's kind of hard to reach with 2 fingers given the opening is so small, but do my best. So I'm reaching in there, and it took a bit of effort, but I managed to pull this out. So that looks like a very healthy taproot. It's very reminiscent of dandelion taproots back when I was a kid and I lived in New York State. So out here in California, I don't really see those stereotypical dandelions that I saw back there. But there are other species that are similar. So I'm going to comb my fingers through this and try my best to dislodge from the bottom with a few fingers. And I'm trying to not use too much force because I don't want to rip this thing, its root system, to shreds and hear this loud devastating break of roots. So it seems like it's anchored in there pretty solidly. These things can grow to be the size of cars or larger, and I'm sure they perhaps weigh much more because they're solid in volume. They have a lot more water weight. Well, maybe not as much as a large car, but I've seen ones that absolutely could not ever be lifted by a human because they're so unwieldy, and in the very least weigh at least half a ton or probably a ton because they've got so much water in there. So it's a fairly robust plant, and even in this small pot, I imagine those thick ropey roots are dug and entrenched into the narrow slits that lead into the watering tray, even though the watering tray is dry most of the time. So I found this thing. That's pretty interesting because it seems to me that this is a runner from the century plant, but the green tip was facing downwards, it seems. Or maybe I just disturbed everything and broke it off and flipped it upside down. So this is actually part of the root system, and that means that so-called weed taproot that I broke off earlier was actually part of the century plant too. And now it all starts to make a lot more sense because the weed had such a weak feeble root system that it was drooping non-stop. Every day when the sun would hit, that thing would droop, and it was too tall for its own good. So now I can easily see why it wasn't getting enough water. Although the century plant's roots only covered maybe a good 30% of the soil volume here, it didn't form a giant root ball with the entire pot. It is a slow-growing plant, but this reminds me of the Yerba Mansa finale episode where I have all these very healthy looking thick white roots that are very ropey in nature, and here you can get good physiology video and lesson for the century plant, which you probably won't find anywhere else on the web in 4K resolution. So you can see the bottom here. So the plant has a very healthy root to shoot ratio, I would say. It's very robust all over. It's just a very tough plant, and it has done very well in this sandy loam, or whatever you want to call it. It's just sand mixed with potting mix, and I bet it's got a lot of diatomaceous earth from when I was using that stuff on everything to deal with fungus gnats, because I didn't sterilize my potting mix 2 to 3 years ago, or didn't sterilize it adequately. So that's a good view of all the roots, and I'm not going to dislodge all the dirt and the root ball because I want to first comb in there and see if there's anything else, any other runners that I may have missed, any oddities. And I combed in there, and since it's very small volume of soil and I didn't want to unleash or displace this potentially contaminated soil that might have parasites or anything in there because it's been in use for so long, into one of my existing sterilization trays that I used to use for baking potting mix in the oven. So I'm going to dig a deep hole. I didn't find any other oddities, any runners, and I decided I want to center this in the pot first of all, because for 2 years this thing has been on the side. It's been in a bad position, and not only that, I want to have it kind of on a synthetic hill and be poking up well over the top of the rim of this pot so it gets more sunlight. That's the other problem. The rim creates a shadow, and this thing was so low-lying to the ground that it lost maybe its first few leaves due to rot. They were wet and embedded in the soil and just unable to photosynthesize after these newer, bigger leaves came up. So I'm sweeping the residual dirt off the table and putting it back in the pot. If anything's contaminated, it's all contaminated. There's no point in being extra careful at this point. So I'm pushing all that down, and since I loosened everything, it's not quite as high as I imagined it would be, or I would like it to be. But I'm planting that runner in what I think is the correct orientation. It's fairly robust, but I took my care not to break it, and I'm going to have it poking up about an inch higher than where I think it should be exposed. And after this, I'm going to get some dry new potting mix after I switch gloves, so I don't transfer any parasites from the old potting mix into the new. And I'll basically make a big mess, of course, but I can wash all of this off later. So now the century plant can get a lot more sunlight, nutrition, and better drainage going forward. Of course, there is a question of can it get enough sunlight being on the floor of the balcony. I'll address that later, and I'll show you. But for the time being, it's been pretty productive. I have all this stuff raised now. It's in the center, and I have the very tip of what I believe to be a runner exposed, and I'm very curious to see if that'll become a new plant. I think it will. It seems like a fairly robust root. And now I'm going to wash off the majority of this loose and dry potting mix. And later on I used a fine brush and some additional watering to get off all the dirt that's been wedged in between the lower leaves for basically the better part of the last year. So I'm going to also fertilize a little bit. I have a squirt bottle that has a little bit of Miracle-Gro dissolved in it and some vitamin in it. And I don't have the footage here, but later on I use the squirt bottle to mildly fertilize with low volumes for both the runner and the main plant, and then I watered a little bit more. So hopefully that'll get things started, and this is just a good washing to get rid of all the dirt. And later on I use the towel and clean the outside. So I moved my succulents off the balcony floor. I made this decision right afterwards because they weren't getting enough sunlight. So it was a simple solution, really. I just moved this entire table forward by about 5 or 6 inches, and that afforded me enough room to have all 5 pots in a staggered fashion. So now everything gets lots of sunlight.